just want to welcome Francis Nordman. You were here yesterday, but I didn't mention you. Francis is a regular daily Matmonim follow and Talmud from Zurich in Switzerland and spends part of his time in Rheinana. We're very happy to have you with us when you are here. And I look forward to being with you in Switzerland at the end of the year. Mitzvah Hashem at your shul. Firstly, a thank you to all of you who have put your name down and registered and sent me messages on matmonimcelebration.com. This is the most beautiful messages, and it means a fortune to me to know who you are. Many of you I didn't even know. And the messages, the notes you sent, I will answer each one personally. I really thank you for that. And for those of you who haven't yet done so, it would be great if you did register on matmonimcelebration.com, where there's an opportunity to let me know that you're listening, what your contact details are. We're not going to spam you. It's just a way of being in touch with you in the occasions that we need to, and an opportunity to communicate and to send a message which has been very meaningful and in fact influenced this year, because many of you gave me an idea of what the things are about the Matmonim that you enjoy, what the things are that you really appreciate. And that inspired to some degree today's shiur, because I've always wanted to visit Barcelona. And I've never been to Barcelona. So this morning I decided to go to Barcelona. You see, when you're in learning, you don't need to get onto a plane to travel. All you need is a mind, some text, and an imagination. Imagination is a very underrated tool of learning and of thinking in today's world, because your mind keeps you rooted to where you are, and your imagination allows you to go where you could be without any limitations. And so with mind and text and an imagination, you can travel, and not only travel across national boundaries and time zones and cultures, but you can travel across centuries. There's no limit to where and how you can travel if you use those facilities. And I want to go to Barcelona not to see the architecture and the town, although that my eyes would find the architecture interesting and beautiful, I'm sure, and my senses would enjoy the city and what goes on in the city. But my neshama wants to connect to my deep friend and Rebbe of 800 years ago, the Rashbo, who lived in Barcelona. And to see that through his eyes, to somehow feel, obviously the city is not the same, but one can transport oneself when one is in a place. So today I did that. I went off to Barcelona in my mind, and I passed the Rashbo's house. I couldn't restrain myself. I stood outside for a few moments. I remember the first time I stood outside Rav Moshe Feinstein's door. And it said in a simple apartment building in the Lower East Side, and on the door it just said Moshe Feinstein. And I couldn't believe that he was waiting for me inside. I stood there paralyzed for about 10 minutes, just looking at this, about to knock on the door. I mean, imagine it's like seeing a door Rambam and knocking on it and walking inside. It was just an unbelievable experience. And I had that experience this morning, Rashbo, with a knocker on the door. So eventually I pluck up the courage and I knock on the door. The Rashbo opens the door so beautifully, so warmly, so embracingly, and gives me a hug. And he says, as a Godel will always say, to get to know where you're at, what are you learning at the moment? I said, Zevachim Daf Lamed Gimel Lamed Aleph. He said, come inside. He said, because my Talmud, Reb Chaim ben Reb Shmuel, is here. And we're just talking about that very piece of Gemara. Just listen in, just sit down, and we're busy with it at the moment. He's telling me about something that his great-grandfather was dealing with. His great-grandfather was the Ravid, and we're discussing it. So I just sat and watched. That's all I did this morning. I didn't have to do anything, just as a fly on the wall, watching Rabbi Chaim ben Shmuel and the Rashbo talking about this particular issue. So the Gemara is on Zevachim Daf Lamed Gimel Lamed Aleph, the anatomy of a Heter, Tumah Dechuyah B'Tzibur. I told them I'm just learning the first line of Daf Lamed Gimel Lamed Aleph. We've just started, and the Gemara starts off and says, Michlal de Tarvayu Svir Lehu Tumah Dechuyahi B'Tzibur. A very broad and general statement. The rest of Daf Lamed Gimel is very intricately interconnected, and I was thinking to myself, preparing the shiur, how can I reduce that to a 20-minute shiur? But this top line, I thought, is such a fundamental principle. That's where I wanted to focus, and I told this to the Rashbo this morning. But where the Gemara says both Abai and Rova seem to hold that when Tumah is Dechuyah B'Tzibur, that means when more than 50% of the community is Tameh, but have to bring a korban tzibur. They have to bring a public korban, like a korban Pesak. It has to be brought on that day. It has to be brought on the 14th of Nisan. You can't wait. More than half of the tzibur is tomeh. So what are you going to do with that? So we have a din in such a case, you bring the korban betumah. You don't worry about the fact that everybody is tomeh, or most people are tomeh. You bring the korban nevertheless, and tumah dexuya b'tzibur. The question that the Gemara deals with, and we have this Gemara in a number of different areas. We had it back in Yuma, in Pesachim. Does that mean that we treat it as if there is no tumah? The Torah just pushes the tumah aside. This spiritual contamination called tumah, it's as if it doesn't exist. Just carry on as normal. Or do we say, no, it does exist, but you're allowed to operate? Although normally tumah gets in the way of avodah, you can't do temple service with tumah, this time you can. You're allowed to do so. Is it dxuya or is it hutra? Do we just temporarily push it aside, or do we actually undo it as if it doesn't exist altogether? And the Gemara says, Abaya and Rava both seem to hold the tumah dexuya b'tzibur, that when we allow the avodah to take place among a community who is predominantly tameh, it's not because there isn't tumah, it's because we choose to ignore the tumah as we move into that situation. And Rashi says what's relevant about Tarvai, about both Abai and Rava holding that, he says, Abai v'Rava sviru tuma d'chuyu b'tzibur v'nafkimina is laman de'omer b'ferikama d'yuma de'omer hutrahi b'tzibur yochid b'mochum rabim. Yes, we have a Gemara in Yuma where we have one view who holds that the tumah is actually undone. There isn't tumah in that situation. The Torah actually erases the tumah without having to go to the mikveh and without having to go through the normal procedures of cleansing the contamination of tumah. The Torah does it just with a statement, there is no tumah. Says Rashi, but from what the Gemara is telling us here, that both Abaya and Rava hold differently, and therefore that is the halacha, that tumah dexuya b'tzibur, that it is only temporary set aside, it isn't completely erased. So you might say, what's that got to do with us? The normal questions we have when we're learning Kodshim, what is the relevance of that? And that was what was so beautiful about listening to the conversation between Reb Chaim ben Reb Shmuel and the Rashba. The conversation was about a question the Raavad had. The Raavid's question was fascinating. A choile, a person who's ill on Shabbos, and the only way he can be saved or cured is if he has some meat. He needs protein. Im yesh lefanav nevela ve'ein shachut im lo shenishchat b'Shabbat. What is the situation? It's Shabbos. There's treif meat available. And there's a cow there. Do we have a shochet shech the cow on Shabbos so that this ill man can eat? Or do we say, no, look, you're going to break something. You've either got to break the laws of Shabbos, you're going to break the laws of Kashrus, rather eat the nevela, rather eat the tray food. An incredibly difficult question. Where do you even go to begin to answer that? You can't just open up a Shulchan Aruch. They didn't have a Shulchan Aruch. Where do you even go to deal with such a question? So what the Raavad says, and we know about the Raavad from the Rosh. The Rosh actually quotes the Raavad, and the Rosh says, Ki yesh omrim mutav sheyavoru alav denevele misheyavru acherim al isur skila. Some say, rather let the sick man, who is the man who has the heter, eat the treif, rather than a shochet, an Adam, Kodesh, a great holy man, pull him out of shul in the middle of Kriyas HaTorah on Shabbos and say, we need you to go to the abattoir and shecht an animal for a sick person. We wouldn't do that. The Raavad himself said, Yesh lomar ki isur Shabbat kvar nitan lidachot b'havara v'vishul v'chamin lo chamin. We already know that for a sick person, you can make a fire, you can boil water, you can cook food. So there are many hilchot Shabbat which are set aside for a sick person. Why would this be any different? However, and therefore, we should shecht. There's nothing wrong with that. The same as you can say to somebody, boil up the water, cook the chicken. So you can say to the shochet, shecht the animal. However, you see the Raavid's humanity. But if it needs immediate attention, and there's a nevela right there, there's a piece of treif steak right there, V'ashachut mitachelo, and to get the shochet out of shul, and to take him to the abattoirs, and to have him shecht, and to bring him back. Of course you give him the treif. You don't think for a moment to delay the solution by getting the shochet because of some halachic preference that you have for the shochet shechting. Clearly you would tell the person to, in that situation, to eat the treif. That's the first answer, the Ravid's answer. The Rosh says, but my Rebbe, the Maharam Rutenberg, dealt with it differently, says the Rosh. You'll see why this is all relevant to the conversation in Barcelona. Says the Rosh, my Rebbe, the Maharam Rutenberg, said, we know that on Yom Tov you're allowed to cook and do whatever you need to prepare a meal. You don't have to sit and think and say, I wonder if I should actually cook. I've got things in the refrigerator that don't need cooking. Maybe we'll just have something cold. You don't need to do that. There's nothing wrong with cooking on Yom Tov. It's perfectly in order. It's the right thing to do. There are no laws of cooking in Yom Tov. In the same way, he says, "Hachinami kivan shehitira Torah pikuach nefesh havikom lacha shosa b'Shabbat b'shvil chodesh yesh bo sakana ki'ilu asaa b'chol." If you're doing something for a seriously ill person on Shabbos, it's as if it's Sunday or Monday. There is no Shabbos when it comes to that. And so you can get the shochet to shech, you can do whatever you need to do. There are no laws. There are no barriers. Somebody's suffering, somebody's ill, somebody needs to be cured. Just as you can cook on Yom Tov, you can cook for the sick person. There are no laws of cooking, says the Maharam Rutenberg. Says the Rosh, I know that's what my Rebbe said, but I heard another reason. So the Rosh clearly isn't all that happy with the Maharam Rutenberg, and we'll see in a moment why. Well, we can look at that right now, because as I learned it as well, I also had a bit of a difficulty with the Maharam Rutenberg. The laws of Yom Tov are not that there is a prohibition of cooking, and it's permitted because it's Yom Tov. We'll ignore the prohibition on Yom Tov. On Yom Tov, there is no Isur Bishul. It's not on Shabbos. There's an Isur Bishul. On Yom Tov and on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, there's no Isur Bishul. But so you can't compare that to a sick person on Shabbos, where you say there is an Isur Bishul, but we will waive the Isur Bishul. We will waive the prohibition of cooking so as to cure the sick person. That's very different from Yom Tov, where on Yom Tov we're saying there never was ever a situation where you weren't allowed to cook on Yom Tov. The laws of cooking didn't apply, or the laws of not cooking didn't apply on Yom Tov and never did. So it's very difficult to understand what the Maharam Rutenberg means. And therefore, says the Rosh, a third reason. I'm afraid, says the Rosh, that if you tell the sick person to eat the treif steak, he won't. He'll be disgusted by the thought, and he won't be able to bring himself to do it. And so, rather shecht, because we don't want to risk the fact that the sick person might not do what's right for him. So the Reb Chaim ben Reb Shmuel, also known as Reb Chaim ben David, tells the Rashba about the Ravid's question, which the Ramban also questioned, and the Ramban doesn't answer. So the Ramban deals with this. I don't even have an approach to this. I don't even have an answer to it. The Ravid answers it. The Maharam Rutenberg answers it. The Rosh answers it. Says the Rashba. So now I'm listening. Now we come back to me listening into this conversation that's happening. And Reb Chaim ben Reb Shmuel is a contemporary of the Rashba, but he's sitting there as a Talmud bifnei Rabbo in absolute awe of his Rebbe, the Rashba. And the Rashba says, Shamati me'echad migdolei harabonim. I heard from a great rabbi. Who does he mean? The Rosh. Where did he hear from the Rosh? What was the relationship? The Rosh, as you know, left Germany after the riots and the pogroms in Germany, and when the Maharam Rutenberg was killed there. It was a terrible time. And he moved west. And he goes through the south of France, he goes through Provence, and gets to Girona, where the Rabbeinu Yonah and the Ramban were, and he goes further to Barcelona. Eventually, the Rosh lands up in Toledo, which is near Madrid. But to get to Toledo, if you look at a map, the only way to get to Toledo from Provence, you have to go down the coast, you have to go through Barcelona. When the Rosh came to Barcelona, he was received there by the Rashba. And he spent a little bit of time in Barcelona. They loved him, the Rashba loved him, and they had time together. During that time that the Rosh was passing through Barcelona, he told the Rashba what the Maharam Rutenberg said about this question. שהראה להטיל לשחוט אפילו במקום שיש בו נבל להאכילו, אלא שהטעם שאמרו לי משמו חלוש מאוד. Says the Rashbo, the reason they told me, meaning the reason the Rosh told me that the Maharam Rutenberg used to allow the shchita is a very weak reason. But notice how he words it. We can learn from every word of these people. He doesn't say, but what the Maharam Rutenberg said is very weak. He said, I don't know what the Maharam Rutenberg said. I only know what they told me the Maharam Rutenberg said. And what they told me that the Maharam Rutenberg said doesn't make sense to me. And therefore, I'm not even writing it down. It's so weak that it's not worth recording. But again, he's not blaming the Maharam Rutenberg. He's saying the way it was passed to me through the Rosh, maybe something was wrong. And that rabbi who told me, that rabbi being the Rosh, that rabbi who told me the story, he gave me the reason that if you don't give him if you ask him to eat treif, the person might not eat and he might die. Velinire, says the Rashbo, and I'll take a completely different view on this. I will look at the anatomy of Heter. When the Torah allows something, what is it doing? Is it saying you can ignore the Isur? Or is it saying there is no Isur? When the Torah says you can cook for a sick person on Shabbos, is that because, as the Rosh says, but for a different reason, is that because, as the Maharam Rutenberg says, but for a different reason, is that because there's no prohibition of cooking if there's a sick person? Or is that, no, there is a prohibition of cooking, but you're allowed to do it. It's a different approach. And that depends on this first line on Daf Lamed Gimel, where the Shabbat Dchuya or Norma Shabbat Hutra Etzachole. Just as where the Gemara looks at this question, when the Torah says if more than half the community is Tameh, you can bring the Korbanot, you can do the Avodah. What is the Torah saying? Yes, they're Tameh, but you're still allowed to do it. Or are they saying, under these circumstances, wash the Tumah away, it doesn't exist? Because that's the way you look at a Heter, when the Torah itself, not just a Pesak, but when the Torah itself is matir, when the Torah takes something which is prohibited and says, in this situation, it is permitted, is the Torah saying the prohibition has disappeared, or is the Torah saying you may act despite the prohibition? That's where you've got to look. You've got to understand the anatomy of Heter. Because if you say that the prohibition completely vanishes, then here, of course, you can ask the shochet to shecht, you do whatever you need to do. But if you want to say that it's just put aside, then you rather give him the tray food. You don't have a basis for the shochet to go and kill an animal, because for him there isn't a law of dichui. For him, there isn't a law of pushing it aside. The sick person, you can push aside the laws for him, but not for the sheikhet. So he says, we don't do an avera so that he can eat. Because it's duchiyah, the Isur is still there. The Isur Shabbat is still there. It's just you're allowed to do it. You're allowed to do it if there's nothing else, if there's no other solution. But he does have another solution. He can eat the treif. If he can eat the treif, why should a shochet be pulled out of shul and sent to the abattoir to shecht an animal? And I'm pretty sure, says the Rashbo, that look at the humility. It doesn't stay. I'm pretty sure he says that the halacha is that on Shabbos, as in the case of Tumah, it's dchuya and not hutra. That the Shabbos is temporarily pushed aside while we solve the problem, and it isn't completely ignored as if it doesn't exist altogether. And therefore, the person, unlike the Ravid's answer, unlike the Maharam Rutenberg's answer, unlike the Rosh's answer, the Rashbo carves his own way through and says, once you understand the anatomy of Heter based on this Gemara, then you understand that this is Dchuya v'lo hutra, the law of Shabbat is still present, and if the law of Shabbat is still present, you can't ask the shochet to shech if there's another solution for the sick person. However, if you say that when somebody is sick, the laws of Shabbat are completely removed, then you can do whatever you need to do to solve it, but that's not the halacha. And for that reason, he ends off saying These things you don't have to ask a goy to do, and you don't have to ask an Amaoret, somebody who doesn't keep Shabbos. In any case, let him do it. Like once I was coming into my building, there's a neighbor there who doesn't keep anything. And he said, please, let me take you up in the elevator on Shabbos, because that way I'm doing a mitzvah. So somebody doesn't keep it. He says, at least that way I'm doing a mitzvah. I don't care about pressing the button, but at least I'm taking you up. So let me do a mitzvah. Quite an interesting and quite an attractive argument. But we don't do that. And even in this case where there's somebody who's ill and needs it, you don't ask an Amaretz, you don't ask a goy. Elo al yedei Gedolei Yisrael. This should be done by Gedolei Yisrael. This should be done by tzaddikim and talmidei chachomim. They're the least to be put out by it. They're the ones who will most understand it. Call if it was hutro, you would call the shoichet out of shul. But in this case, you don't do that. You rather let the person eat the treif, because the dexuya here, and therefore ma'achilin lo anavelo. You give him the treif. Just listening to this conversation, understanding appreciating the first conversation that took place between the Rosh and the Rashba when the Rosh was passing through Barcelona on his way to Toledo, and then later on the conversation between the Rashba and his Talmud in Barcelona, going through the Ravid's question, understanding the Maram Rutenberg and the Rosh's answer, and the Rashba saying, but if you get to first principles and you understand the anatomy of Heter, you'll understand that the answer is not as they said. The answer is different, that the sick person in this case should eat the treif rather than shech the kosher animal.